Jason sat in his father's study, his fingers tracing the edges of the heavy mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather. It was the kind of desk that carried an air of history, imposing and steadfast, just like his father. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, each representing a chapter in the empire his father had built. Every detail of the room exuded power, success, and legacy. But to Jason, it all felt suffocating. He leaned back in the leather chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling estate. The vast expanse of manicured lawns and private gardens stretched for miles, a symbol of the wealth and influence his father had accumulated over decades. Jason had everything anyone could want: money, status, connections. But none of it brought him happiness. None of it brought him fulfillment. The pressure weighed heavily on him every single day. The expectation that he would eventually take over the family business, that he would somehow measure up to the monumental success of his father, gnawed at his soul. Jason had always been the heir apparent, groomed for this life from the moment he could walk. His father had ensured he received the best education, the best mentors, the best resources. Yet, with all of it, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being a failure. His father had built a global empire, one that spanned industries: technology, real estate, energy. People revered him. They feared him. And they were all waiting for Jason to take his place as the next leader of the company, as the next titan of industry. But Jason couldn't help but feel like a shadow in his father's towering presence. His father had accomplished more in a decade than Jason had in his entire life. It wasn't just the business world that Jason felt overshadowed in, it was everything. Jason had tried, repeatedly, to prove himself. He had launched multiple business ventures, each of them failed in one way or another. The first was a tech startup, which he thought would revolutionize the industry. He spent months working on it, pouring his heart and soul into the project. But when it came time to pitch the idea to his father, Jason's hopes were dashed. His father barely looked up from his papers when Jason presented his idea, dismissing it as just another tech gimmick. The rejection stung, but it was not surprising. Jason's father had always been quick to dismiss ideas that didn't align with his own vision. And, more than anything, Jason's father had no tolerance for failure. The next venture was a real estate project, an upscale development on the edge of the city. Jason believed it was a solid investment, one that would attract high-net-worth individuals looking for luxury and exclusivity. But the market wasn't right. The project floundered, and Jason found himself once again facing a sea of disappointment. His father had not even been sympathetic. "You're wasting your time, Jason," he had said, shaking his head in disdain. "This isn't a hobby. You're playing at being a businessman, but you don't have what it takes." The words stung, but Jason could never escape them. They echoed in his head every time he attempted something new, each failure only confirming what his father had said. Jason's ideas were never good enough. His efforts, never enough. His father's expectations, always out of reach. It wasn't just his father who made him feel like a failure. Everyone around him seemed to echo the same sentiment, even if they didn't say it outright. Jason's closest friends were constantly offering advice, suggesting he take over one of the family businesses, follow in his father's footsteps, and stop trying to prove himself in other ways. They meant well, but the truth was, Jason hated the idea of simply following in his father's footsteps. He didn't want to just inherit a legacy, he wanted to build one of his own. But the fear of failure paralyzed him. He wanted to prove to himself and to his father that he could make something meaningful. He wanted to show the world that he was more than just a rich kid living off his father's success. But Jason had no idea how to go about it. Every idea he had seemed to fall short, and each failure only deepened his sense of inadequacy. His father's dismissive attitude towards his latest venture had been the final blow. After hearing about Jason's newest project, an innovative tech-driven sustainability initiative, his father had brushed it off as a waste of resources and not the type of venture that aligns with the company's values. It wasn't the first time his father had dismissed his ideas, but this time, something inside Jason snapped. He stared out of the window, the weight of his father's words still fresh in his mind. "You're not cut out for this, Jason." The words stung. The rejection felt suffocating. But in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason made a decision. He was done trying to fit into the mold his father had created for him. If he wanted to prove himself, he couldn't keep chasing after validation from someone who would never give it to him. He had to forge his own path, no matter how difficult it might be. His father might never see him as anything more than a disappointment, but Jason wasn't going to let that define him any longer. If he was going to fail, he would fail on his own terms, with an idea that he believed in, something that could change the world. He would no longer be content to live in his father's shadow, waiting for approval that would never come. The idea for his new project wasn't fully formed yet, but Jason felt a spark of hope. It was ambitious, daring even, but that's exactly what he needed. He needed something that would push him to his limits, something that would test every ounce of his ability and determination. And maybe, just maybe, it would finally prove to his father and to himself that he was capable of achieving greatness. Jason stood up from the chair, his mind racing with possibilities. The decision was made. He would pursue this new project with everything he had, even if it meant going against his father's wishes. It was time for Jason to stop being defined by his father's legacy. It was time to build his own. As he walked out of the study and into the hallway, Jason's heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. This was his moment. He didn't know how long it would take, or if he would even succeed. But one thing was certain: he was no longer going to let his father's shadow loom over him. Jason was going to make his own mark on the world. And no matter what happened, he would face it with the courage to finally be himself. Jason sat at his desk, his eyes glued to the glowing screen in front of him. His mind raced as he reviewed the numbers, the projections, the timelines. He had poured every ounce of energy, every last bit of savings, into this project. It was his chance, his one shot at proving to the world, and to his father, that he could stand on his own. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was personal. Jason was determined to show that he wasn't just another privileged son of a powerful man, destined to follow in someone else's footsteps. He wanted to carve out his own path, to be recognized for his brilliance, for his ambition, for his drive. But as the days passed, the promise of success began to fade. Slowly at first, like a quiet whisper of doubt that Jason tried to ignore. The first signs of trouble came when the investors who had seemed so eager at the start began pulling away. The enthusiasm they had once shown for his idea had turned into disinterest, even skepticism. Calls went unanswered, emails were met with silence, and promises made in early meetings were suddenly forgotten. Jason tried to remain optimistic, telling himself that this was just part of the process. But each passing day made it harder to convince himself. The technical setbacks began to pile up soon after. Jason had underestimated how complex the product would be to develop. What had seemed like a simple concept turned into a labyrinth of challenges: software glitches, production delays, faulty prototypes. His engineering team, small and inexperienced, struggled to meet deadlines, and each failure felt like a personal affront. He had poured his resources into the project, and now he could see them slipping away, like water running through his fingers. As the failures mounted, so did the pressure. Jason's phone, once buzzing with messages from eager investors and potential partners, now lay silent on his desk. He reached out to his high-powered business connections for advice, but their responses were hollow, offering no real help or solutions. "Maybe you should reevaluate your strategy," one suggested, while another simply advised, "It's a tough market right now." Jason could hear the thinly veiled indifference in their voices, their lack of true concern. They weren't invested in him, they were just waiting for him to fail so they could distance themselves from the fallout. And fail he was. As the isolation began to set in, Jason found himself retreating further into his own mind. The once constant buzz of ideas, of excitement for his project, had dulled. Now, all that filled the silence was the harsh reality of mounting debt and lost opportunities. The dream he had nurtured, the vision he had held onto so tightly, was beginning to feel like an illusion, a mirage he had chased until it was too late. His father's voice echoed in his mind, the words from their last conversation cutting through his self-doubt. "You're making a mistake. This is too risky. You should have stayed with what you know." Jason had rejected those words then, but now, in the face of failure, they began to ring true. He had chosen the risky path, the road less traveled, but it wasn't leading him anywhere but down. Jason sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He had given everything to this, his time, his energy, his money. And now, all of it seemed like a waste. The thought of going back to his father, admitting that he had failed, was unbearable. He couldn't face that, couldn't face the disappointment that would surely come from it. His father had always believed in playing it safe, in taking the tried and true path. Jason had wanted to prove him wrong, but now, he wasn't so sure that his father's way hadn't been the right one. It was in the midst of this spiraling sense of failure that Jason first crossed paths with Ray, the janitor who worked at his father's company. Ray was a man of few words, someone Jason had never paid much attention to before. He was always there, quietly cleaning the halls, sweeping the floors, emptying the trash cans. Jason had passed him countless times without a second thought, assuming that Ray was just another anonymous employee, beneath him in status, if not in humanity. But that day, as Jason was leaving his father's office, feeling the weight of his failure heavier than ever, he noticed Ray sitting on a bench near the elevator, a broom resting beside him. He was wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes focused on something in the distance, seemingly lost in thought. Jason paused, the bitterness of the past few weeks swirling in his chest, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself walking over to the man. Ray looked up, and their eyes met. There was something in his gaze, calm, unhurried, yet steady, that caught Jason off guard. It was as though Ray had seen something in Jason that he hadn't yet seen in himself. Without a word, Ray gestured to the seat next to him, and Jason, for reasons he couldn't explain, sat down. They sat in silence for a long moment, and Jason felt the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He wanted to speak, to share his frustrations, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything at first. Finally, Ray broke the silence. "You look like you're carrying a lot," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "You know, sometimes we carry things we don't need to. It's like holding onto a rock that's too heavy, just because we're afraid to let it go." Jason looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the words. They were so understated, yet they hit him like a punch to the gut. Let it go. It sounded so easy, but Jason had been holding on to so much for so long, the desire to prove himself, the fear of disappointing his father, the weight of his ambition. It had all felt like one big, unshakable rock, and he didn't know how to let it go. I don't know what I'm doing, Jason admitted, his voice raw. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I could make it work, but now it feels like everything's falling apart. Ray nodded, his eyes soft but understanding. Most people don't figure it out right away. Hell, they don't figure it out at all. But sometimes the biggest mistake is thinking we have to do it all alone. Jason looked at Ray, surprised. The janitor's unassuming presence felt like the opposite of everything Jason had known, everything he had tried to achieve. Ray wasn't high-powered, he wasn't a businessman or an investor. He was just there, a steady force in the background. Yet, somehow, in that moment, Ray seemed to have more wisdom than all of Jason's connections combined. I'm not sure I'm cut out for this, Jason confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Ray's eyes didn't waver. Sometimes, the things that seem impossible are the things that teach us the most. You'll figure it out, one way or another. Just don't let yourself get lost in the fall. There's always something to learn from it. Jason sat there for a moment, letting the words sink in. It was hard to admit it, but maybe Ray was right. Maybe he didn't have to do it all alone. Maybe failure wasn't the end, maybe it was just another part of the journey. As Jason stood up to leave, he gave Ray a brief nod of gratitude, unsure if the man even realized how much his words had meant. But as he walked back to his office, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The road ahead was uncertain, the challenges daunting, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about never falling. It was about how you got back up. Jason's world was slowly crumbling. What was once a promising venture, full of potential and optimism, had become a series of failed attempts and shattered promises. Every meeting with his advisors felt like a step deeper into the mire of frustration. His father had cut the funding, and the business world that Jason thought he knew now seemed like a maze of politics, power plays, and betrayal. Investors had pulled back, deals had fallen through, and every decision Jason made seemed to make the situation worse. The pressure was suffocating, and he could feel the weight of his father's legacy bearing down on him with an almost unbearable intensity. It was during one of his darkest days, after yet another disastrous meeting with his team, that Jason found himself aimlessly wandering the hallways of his father's company. The building, once a symbol of strength and success, now felt like a maze he couldn't navigate. His thoughts were muddled, his mind a fog of doubt and self-criticism. He needed a place to escape, even if just for a moment, so he ended up in the last place he'd expected to go, the janitor's closet. Jason had always been vaguely aware of Ray, the janitor who worked at the company. Ray was a fixture, always there, quietly cleaning, maintaining the company's vast offices, and generally staying out of the way. Jason had never paid much attention to him, seeing him as little more than a background character in the corporate machine. But today, in his defeat, Jason found himself standing in front of the small, cluttered room where Ray stored his cleaning supplies. It wasn't that he was seeking Ray's company, it was just that he didn't want to face anyone else. He slipped inside the closet, shut the door behind him, and let out a long, shaky breath. For a moment, Jason closed his eyes and leaned against the shelves. It felt as though everything around him was falling apart, and he was powerless to stop it. The weight of failure, of disappointing his father, of watching his dreams crumble, was too much to bear. You okay in there, son? Ray's voice cut through the silence, low and calm. Jason's eyes snapped open, startled by the interruption. He hadn't expected anyone to come by, much less Ray. Yeah, Jason said quickly, though it was clear he wasn't. He let out another breath, trying to hide the tension that was building in his chest. Just need a moment. Ray didn't push, didn't ask more questions than Jason was willing to answer. Instead, he simply stepped into the closet and began tidying up the corner of the room as if it was a completely normal thing to do, walking into a corporate executive's emotional space without a second thought. It was almost soothing, the simplicity of it. Ray wasn't concerned with appearances, with business protocols, or with any of the trappings of power. He was just doing his job. After a moment, Ray glanced over at Jason. You know, he said casually, failure isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Jason stiffened. He looked at Ray, bewildered. What do you mean? Everything's falling apart. I've lost everything: money, deals, investors. And now my dad's cutting me off. What's the beginning in all of this? Ray's expression remained unchanged, a quiet sort of wisdom emanating from his calm demeanor. It's simple, really, he said, his voice steady. Failure's not the thing to be afraid of. It's just part of the process. You can't be afraid to fall down. Everyone does it. What matters is what you do after you fall. How you get back up. That's the beginning, son. Jason's first instinct was to dismiss Ray's words as naivete. What could a janitor possibly know about failure in the business world? Ray didn't have the education, the experience, or the pedigree that Jason had. He was just a man who cleaned up after the real players. And yet, for reasons Jason couldn't entirely explain, something in Ray's simple words stuck with him. As days passed, Jason began running into Ray more frequently. It wasn't by design. He didn't go out of his way to seek Ray's company, but somehow, their paths kept crossing. In the halls, at the coffee machine, or, as it had started, in the janitor's closet. Each time, Ray would offer some small nugget of wisdom, something so simple and unassuming that Jason found himself intrigued. It wasn't grand, dramatic advice. It was more like a series of quiet suggestions, little pieces of perspective that Jason hadn't considered before. One morning, after yet another failed meeting with a potential investor, Jason found himself standing in front of Ray as the janitor mopped the floors. He didn't even think about it, he just spoke, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Nothing seems to work. I keep failing, and I don't know how to stop it. Ray paused for a moment, then looked at Jason, the mop in his hand. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Ray said thoughtfully. You're not supposed to stop it. Failure's not something you stop. It's something you learn to live with. You just don't let it define you. Jason frowned, unsure of how to respond. I don't understand. How am I supposed to just live with failure? This isn't a game. I'm losing everything. Ray gave him a slight smile, the kind of smile that spoke of years of experience. Life's not a game, no. But it's not a war either. You don't have to win every battle. You just have to keep moving. Failures are like bumps in the road. You can't avoid them, but you can sure as hell learn how to navigate around them. Jason was quiet for a long time after that, the words sinking in slowly. He had spent so much time trying to avoid failure, trying to maintain control, that he hadn't realized he was doing more damage than good. He had tried to make everything perfect, to ensure that every move he made was the right one. But it was never enough. The pressure had always been too much. The more he tried to control everything, the more it slipped through his fingers. Ray's advice, though simple, began to shift something in Jason. Slowly, he started to see things differently. He couldn't control every outcome. He couldn't make things perfect. But maybe he didn't have to. Maybe the key was in learning to be okay with the uncertainty, with the failures. Maybe it was okay to not have all the answers, to make mistakes along the way. Over time, Jason began applying Ray's insights in his own life. He let go of the need for perfection and began to embrace a new kind of approach to business. He started thinking of failure not as an end, but as part of the process. Every mistake became a lesson, every setback an opportunity to learn something new. He was no longer afraid to fail, because he knew that failure wasn't the thing that defined him. How he responded to it was what mattered. Despite the growing respect Jason had for Ray, he couldn't escape the pressure of his father's expectations. That weight still bore down on him, the unspoken challenge to live up to the legacy, to prove he could succeed where others had faltered. But as Ray's simple wisdom continued to guide him, Jason found himself more and more focused on the process, on growth, rather than the outcome. The more he interacted with Ray, the more Jason realized that it wasn't the money, the deals, or the legacy that defined success. It was about resilience. It was about how you bounced back after life knocked you down. And with every conversation, every lesson from Ray, Jason felt a little bit lighter, a little more able to carry the weight of his failures and turn them into something better. Ray's words hit Jason harder than any critique, any failure, or any setback he had encountered up until that point. The lesson Ray shared was simple, yet profoundly powerful: the only failure that matters is the one where you stop trying. Jason sat with this phrase for what felt like an eternity, feeling the weight of it sink deep into his chest. For as long as he could remember, failure had been his greatest fear, a terrifying abyss he avoided at all costs. Every decision, every move, every choice had been calculated to prevent him from failing. He had been trapped by the idea that failure was final, that it defined him, that it was an irreversible stain on his character and potential. He had let that fear control him, to the point where it paralyzed him into inaction. But now, Ray's words shattered that perception. The only failure that truly mattered, the one that was unforgivable, was the failure to keep trying. The realization was like a spark igniting in Jason's mind. He understood, for the first time, that his fear of failure wasn't just keeping him from taking risks, it was keeping him from moving forward entirely. By avoiding failure, he had been avoiding progress. Every missed opportunity, every half-hearted attempt to launch his project, every time he hesitated to take the next step had been because of this fear. And it wasn't just about the fear of disappointing others, it was the fear of disappointing himself. The truth was, he hadn't been trying his hardest at all. He had been trying to protect himself from the emotional devastation of failure, but in doing so, he had boxed himself into a place of stagnation. Ray's lesson cracked open something inside him, something Jason had been too afraid to acknowledge before: perfectionism. Jason had been trying to create something flawless, something that would garner the approval of his father, his investors, and the world around him. His desire for perfection had caused him to spend countless hours refining, revising, and second-guessing his every move. Every change he made was an attempt to avoid criticism, to make sure everything was just right, to ensure success was certain. But the more he focused on perfection, the further away he moved from actual progress. He wasn't failing, he was just stalling. Ray's encouragement to embrace imperfection and take the leap without worrying about the outcome was the final push Jason needed. He had been paralyzed by the fear that any misstep would be catastrophic, that one mistake could unravel everything. But Ray had shown him that imperfection wasn't something to avoid, it was something to embrace. Every failure, every misstep, was simply a part of the process, a stepping stone on the path to success. The only real failure, Jason now realized, was stopping altogether. With this new understanding, Jason's approach to his project began to shift dramatically. He stopped obsessing over getting every detail perfect and started focusing on making tangible progress. It was a mental shift that changed the course of his work, but also his outlook on life. The project, which had previously felt like a weight, now felt like an exciting challenge. Rather than fearing mistakes, Jason started looking for opportunities to learn from them. He redefined success as not an end result, but as the growth that came from pushing himself past his comfort zone. Determined to put this new philosophy into practice, Jason took bold steps in reshaping the project. The first thing he did was re-evaluate his team. In the past, he had surrounded himself with people who were just as risk-averse as he was. His team had been cautious, hesitant to take chances, always trying to control every possible outcome. Jason realized that this approach was stifling the creative energy the project needed. He needed people who weren't afraid to take risks, to fail, and to learn. He began bringing in people who were willing to challenge the status quo, who weren't concerned with playing it safe. This change energized the project, injecting it with new ideas and perspectives that hadn't been there before. Next, Jason adjusted his strategy. Instead of aiming for a perfect launch, he decided to implement an iterative approach: test, evaluate, and adjust. He would release smaller versions of the product, gather feedback, and improve it in real time. This allowed for room to fail, but more importantly, it allowed for room to learn. By accepting that failure was not the end, Jason began to see it as part of the feedback loop necessary for innovation. Every setback was now viewed as valuable information, helping him course correct and refine his approach. Jason also began to look at his own role differently. Instead of being the lone figure carrying the burden of perfection, he embraced his role as a leader who could guide and support his team through both successes and failures. He created an environment where mistakes were not punished, but seen as an integral part of the process. His attitude shifted from one of fear and anxiety to one of optimism and possibility. Jason realized that in order for his team to thrive, he had to be willing to show vulnerability and take risks himself. The change in Jason was profound. Where once there was hesitation and doubt, there was now confidence and clarity. He had let go of the heavy weight of perfectionism and was now operating from a place of self-assurance. He understood that no one, not even his father or his investors, would expect him to be perfect. What they wanted was progress, growth, and the willingness to adapt. And in that moment, Jason began to trust himself. He trusted that even if things didn't go according to plan, he would figure it out. That was the essence of true success, not avoiding failure, but learning how to navigate it and grow from it. Jason's shift wasn't just about his project, it was about his entire approach to life. He no longer saw himself as someone who had to live up to the expectations of others, nor did he feel the crushing pressure to always be successful. He understood now that success was about the journey, not the destination, and that each step forward, no matter how imperfect, was a victory. By embracing the idea that failure was not something to be feared, but something to be learned from, Jason had finally taken the leap he had been so terrified of. The transformation inside Jason was profound and lasting. No longer paralyzed by his fear of failure, he was now living with purpose and conviction, making bold decisions and taking risks. And for the first time, he felt free from the expectations of others, free from the need for perfection, and free to build something that was truly his own. The lesson Ray had shared with him wasn't just a lesson about business, it was a lesson about life. And with that lesson, Jason was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that as long as he kept trying, he would never truly fail. Jason's decision to break away from his father's traditional business practices and follow his own unconventional approach was a bold and defining moment in his life. However, as the days passed, it became clear that bold decisions came with steep consequences. The project, once filled with promise and potential, now seemed to be hanging by a thread, facing challenges that only seemed to multiply the further Jason veered from the familiar path. At first, everything seemed to be aligning. His new vision had sparked some initial interest, and he had the confidence of his own team behind him. But that momentum quickly faded as the harsh reality of his choice began to set in. Investors, once eager to fund the next big idea, began to back away. They cited the risks involved in the new direction and questioned whether Jason's approach was sustainable in the long term. The traditional investors who had supported the company in the past found themselves uncomfortable with the change, unwilling to take a gamble on something so different from the tried and true methods that had worked for them before. This was a blow to Jason, but the hardest hit came from his father. The man who had built the family business from the ground up, the man who had always set the course for Jason's future, was furious. His father's disappointment was palpable, not just in his words, but in his actions. A series of tense, angry phone calls followed, each one more hostile than the last. Jason's decision to go against everything his father had taught him was seen as an act of defiance, a rejection of the legacy his father had worked so hard to build. In one heated conversation, his father threatened to cut him off completely financially, emotionally, and professionally. The words stung, but they were a reminder of the gulf that had always existed between them, a gulf that Jason had hoped to close by stepping out on his own. Instead, it had only widened. Jason tried to reassure himself that this was the price of following his vision. He had always known that breaking free from his father's shadow would come with costs. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize the situation, the weight of his choices began to feel unbearable. His financial backing was evaporating, his relationship with his father was hanging by a thread, and the pressure to succeed seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. In the quiet moments, Jason found himself alone in his thoughts, questioning whether he had made the right decision. He wondered if he had been too rash, too eager to prove himself, without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. The reality of failure seemed closer than ever. The project, once a symbol of his independence and potential, now felt like a sinking ship. Every investor that pulled out, every harsh word from his father, made the possibility of losing everything feel more imminent. Jason's reputation, which had been built on his father's name, was now at risk. If this venture failed, how would he ever be seen again? Would he be known as the man who tried and failed, or as the man who foolishly walked away from success? This was the emotional turmoil Jason found himself in. The loneliness, the doubt, the fear of losing everything he had worked so hard for, it all weighed on him. For the first time in a long while, he questioned his own worth. Had he made a mistake? Was he delusional to think that he could succeed without the safety net his father had always provided? It was easy to tell himself that failure was part of the journey, that setbacks were just stepping stones. But when those setbacks feel like they're threatening to destroy everything you've built, it's hard not to feel defeated. Yet, through all of this, there was one person who refused to let him fall into despair: Ray. Ray had been Jason's friend and mentor for years, someone who had always supported him, even when Jason's decisions didn't make sense to others. Ray saw the potential in Jason when no one else did, and it was Ray's belief in him that kept Jason from spiraling too far into self-doubt. Despite the mounting pressure and the looming possibility of failure, Ray remained a steady source of encouragement. "Setbacks aren't the end, Jason," Ray told him during one of their late-night conversations. "They're part of the process. You can't let a few failures define you. It's not the mistakes that matter, but what you do after them." Jason couldn't help but appreciate Ray's unwavering optimism, even when it felt out of place. It was hard to see the bigger picture when everything seemed to be crumbling around him. But Ray's words began to sink in, reminding him that this was just a chapter in a much larger story. Failure didn't define him, it was merely a detour on the road to something greater. Still, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the project was slipping through his fingers. The pressure was intense, and the isolation that came with it was suffocating. He didn't feel like he had anyone to turn to. His father was no longer a source of support, his investors were pulling away, and even his team, though loyal, seemed to be losing faith. There were moments when Jason felt like he was drowning, like no matter how hard he swam, he was being pulled under. But in the midst of all this turmoil, something began to shift inside him. The fear of failure, the fear of losing everything, no longer paralyzed him. Instead of running from those fears, Jason found himself confronting them head-on. The idea of losing his reputation or his financial backing no longer seemed as important as it once had. What mattered now was his belief in the project, his belief in himself. He realized that even if he lost everything, even if the venture failed and he had to start over, he would still have something more valuable: his autonomy, his vision, and the courage to fight for what he believed in. Jason stopped focusing on the looming possibility of failure and began to shift his focus to what he could control: his actions, his decisions, and his response to the challenges that lay ahead. No longer was he driven by the fear of losing his father's approval or his investors' confidence. He began to understand that the price of following his own path was not just losing external validation, but gaining something far more important: his own sense of self. In the days that followed, Jason made the difficult choice to double down on his vision, even if it meant losing everything he had known. He reached out to new investors, restructured the project once again, and pushed forward with even more determination. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid of the outcome. Whether he succeeded or failed, he would be doing it on his terms. Through the emotional wreckage, Jason came to realize that the greatest victory wasn't the external success or validation he had sought for so long. It was the internal strength he had uncovered: the strength to keep going even when the odds seemed insurmountable, and the courage to stand firm in his choices, no matter the cost. Jason had spent years running a race that he had never truly wanted to run. For so long, his life had been defined by the expectations of others, the constant need for validation, the pressure to meet external benchmarks of success. He had always thought that if he could just prove himself, if he could just achieve enough, everything would finally click into place. But the deeper he went into the project, the more he realized that the real struggle was not with the external challenges he faced but with his internal turmoil. The fear of failure, the anxiety of disappointing others, and the ever-present need for approval had held him back more than any business obstacle ever could. The weight of it all had been suffocating. At times, Jason had felt as though the project was consuming him, each decision, each setback taking a piece of his sense of self. But the conversations with Ray had opened his eyes to a new way of thinking, one that went beyond external measures of success. Ray, with his calm demeanor and his philosophical outlook on life, had helped Jason see something crucial: success didn't have to be defined by what others thought of him. Success didn't have to be about achieving perfection or meeting someone else's standard. It was about doing something true to himself, something that felt authentic, something he could look back on and know that he had given it his all, not for others, but for his own growth and self-acceptance. That realization hit Jason harder than anything else. His need for validation had been his greatest obstacle. He had built his career, his relationships, and his sense of self-worth on shaky foundations, always striving to please others, to meet expectations. He had believed that by achieving external success, he would somehow be able to fill the emptiness inside him. But now, with Ray's guidance, Jason understood that real fulfillment couldn't come from other people's approval. It had to come from within. With this new perspective, Jason decided to approach the project differently. He wouldn't go back to the drawing board to fix things for anyone else. He wasn't going to try to please his boss, his colleagues, or even his father. This time, he was going to create something that was true to him, something that reflected his own values, his own vision. He realized that his previous attempts had been driven by fear, fear of failure, fear of disappointing people. Now, he was determined to lead the project with purpose and clarity, trusting his instincts and making decisions that felt aligned with his own sense of integrity. The first step was to reassess his priorities. Jason had been so focused on the end result, on making the project a success by any means necessary, that he had lost sight of why he started it in the first place. The project wasn't just about meeting deadlines or impressing people. It was about creating something meaningful, something that could have a lasting impact. For the first time, Jason understood that the journey was just as important as the destination. He needed to give himself permission to make mistakes, to embrace the setbacks, and to learn from them rather than fear them. Only then would he be able to truly grow. As Jason refocused, he began to shed the weight of his previous insecurities. He wasn't looking for validation anymore. He wasn't searching for approval from his father or from anyone else. Instead, he sought to create something that aligned with his values. It wasn't going to be easy. The project still had significant challenges ahead, and Jason knew that the road would be difficult. But for the first time, he was okay with that. He wasn't afraid of failure anymore. He wasn't afraid of not being good enough. He was ready to take risks, to make decisions based on his intuition, and to trust that the lessons learned along the way were just as valuable as any success. Despite this newfound sense of clarity, Jason's relationship with his father remained strained. His father, a man who had always prided himself on his achievements, still didn't understand why Jason had chosen to take a different path. His father expected Jason to follow in his footsteps, to climb the corporate ladder and achieve the same kind of success that he had. But Jason wasn't interested in that life anymore. He had spent years trying to live up to his father's expectations, and all it had brought him was stress, self-doubt, and unhappiness. Now, he had to face the reality that his father might never understand his choices. Jason knew that this disconnect wasn't something that could be resolved overnight. Years of strained communication, unmet expectations, and unresolved tensions couldn't be healed in a single conversation. But he realized that he no longer needed his father's approval to feel validated. That didn't mean he didn't care about their relationship, it simply meant that he had learned to find his own sense of worth. Jason knew that if he was ever going to have a chance at reconciliation, it would have to come from a place of understanding, not from trying to meet his father's demands. He wasn't going to change who he was to please anyone, not even his father. Jason took a small but meaningful step toward reconciliation. One evening, he reached out to his father with a simple message: "I think we need to talk." It wasn't much, but it was a sign that Jason was ready to acknowledge the pain of their disconnect and take the first step toward healing. It wasn't about fixing everything at once, it was about starting a conversation, about letting his father know that he was still there, still willing to try. Jason didn't expect an immediate resolution, but he did feel a sense of relief knowing that he had taken the initiative. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to prove himself. He was simply trying to connect, to understand, and to move forward in his own way. As Jason prepared for the final phase of the project, his resolve was stronger than it had ever been. He wasn't operating out of fear anymore. He wasn't consumed by the need for validation. He was doing this because it mattered to him, because it represented his growth and his authenticity. He had come to understand that true success wasn't about the end result, it was about the journey, about doing things for the right reasons, and about becoming the person he was always meant to be. With renewed confidence and clarity, Jason took the next steps in the project with a sense of calm purpose. There would be more challenges ahead, no doubt. There would be setbacks and frustrations, but he no longer felt like he was fighting a battle against himself. This time, he was fighting for something that mattered to him, his own truth. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. Jason paced back and forth in the quiet conference room, feeling a sense of calm that surprised him. Just weeks ago, the weight of failure had nearly crushed him, and now, standing before this pivotal moment, he felt nothing but a quiet resolve. He had finally understood what it meant to lead not through fear, manipulation, or blind ambition, but through purpose. His focus had shifted drastically over the past several months. He was no longer obsessed with meeting external expectations, with satisfying the demands of investors or proving himself to his father. What mattered now was the mission, creating something that truly resonated with the values he held most dear: resilience, innovation, and the power of collaboration. This was not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it was about building something that could genuinely make a difference, not just for his business, but for the people it affected. Jason had spent weeks assembling his team, carefully selecting individuals who shared this vision. These were not the typical yes men or career climbers, they were passionate, creative thinkers who believed in the project for what it could represent. Each team member had a unique skill set, but what tied them all together was their unwavering commitment to the idea of building something that mattered. Together, they formed a collective unit, where each person contributed their knowledge, creativity, and energy toward a shared goal. It was more than just a team, it was a movement, driven by values that were deeply ingrained in their work. As the team came together, so did the project. What had once been a disjointed collection of ideas and half-formed plans was beginning to take shape in ways Jason had never anticipated. They were innovating in ways he hadn't considered, pushing boundaries and experimenting with fresh concepts that made the project not only viable but exciting. Every meeting, every brainstorming session was infused with enthusiasm and optimism. The shift in focus, moving away from simply chasing profit to making a real impact, had ignited something in the team that Jason hadn't expected. There was a spark in the room now, a sense of shared purpose that breathed new life into the project. Yet, the stakes were higher than ever. The project had already attracted significant attention, both positive and negative. The financial backing was fragile, and Jason knew that without this round of investment, the entire endeavor could collapse. Investors had their own agendas, their own expectations, and Jason had learned that their interests rarely aligned with his ideals. He had managed to secure the meeting, but the pressure was immense. This wasn't just a pitch for more funding, it was the final push that would either solidify the project's future or bring it all crashing down. Jason sat down with his team for the last time before the meeting. The atmosphere was charged with nervous energy, but there was also an undercurrent of excitement. The team had worked tirelessly to perfect every detail, refining the business model and its potential for impact. But what they were presenting wasn't just about the numbers. It was about a vision, a belief in a future that was different from the one the investors were used to hearing. They weren't selling a product, they were selling a movement, a chance to be part of something bigger than just financial gain. "We've done everything we can," Jason said, his voice steady. "Now it's about staying true to the vision. This is about more than just making money, it's about making a difference. And we can't compromise on that. We have to show them why this is worth it, why it matters." His team nodded in agreement. They had come so far, and though they all understood the risks, there was a sense of unity and purpose that gave them strength. They knew that whatever happened in the pitch, they had already created something far more valuable than just a business venture. They had created a community, a group of like-minded individuals working toward a shared goal. The day of the pitch arrived, and Jason walked into the sleek boardroom, the familiar coldness of the space no longer intimidating. He had been here before, a nervous, uncertain man, trying to convince investors that his ideas were worth their time and money. But today was different. Today, he wasn't trying to win approval, he was here to present something that mattered, something he believed in deeply. There would be no more pretending, no more playing it safe. This was his final push, and he was determined to give it everything he had. The investors filed in, their expressions unreadable, their eyes scanning Jason and his team with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They were used to hearing pitches, used to hearing promises of growth, profit, and success. But Jason was determined to break from that mold. He didn't want to be another CEO selling them another idea about the bottom line. Instead, he wanted them to see the heart of the project, to understand that this was about more than just dollars and cents. Jason took a deep breath, then began. "Thank you for giving us this opportunity. What we're here to present today is not just another business proposition. It's a vision. A vision of what we believe the future can be if we start thinking differently about what we value, about how we work, and about what truly matters." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, and he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. But instead of feeling the familiar anxiety, he felt a sense of calm. This was his truth, his passion. If they didn't see it, if they didn't believe in it, he would accept it. But he wasn't going to hide behind empty promises anymore. This was the real thing. "We believe that resilience and innovation should be at the heart of everything we do. That it's not just about selling products or services, it's about creating lasting change, building something that contributes to the world in a meaningful way. We're not asking you to just invest in a company. We're asking you to invest in an idea, in a vision that challenges the status quo. And we're willing to take the risks with you, because we believe in this vision, and we believe in what we can accomplish together." Jason's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the words flowing more easily as he shared the details of the project. He spoke about their commitment to the mission, their innovative approach, and the lessons they had learned along the way. His team presented their research and projections, showing that the project was not only feasible but poised for success if they were given the chance to make it happen. As he finished, Jason looked at the investors, waiting for their response. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, one of the investors, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. This is ambitious, she said, her voice low. But I'll admit there's something here. Something real. You're not just selling us a business. You're selling us an idea. And that's something we can get behind. The other investors murmured in agreement. Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let it show. He had made his pitch, and now all he could do was wait for the final decision. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about the investors anymore. It was about something bigger than that. No matter what happened, Jason had found his confidence. He had found his voice. And in doing so, he had become the leader he had always hoped he could be. The final push was no longer about proving himself to others, it was about staying true to his values and leading with integrity. And in that moment, Jason knew that whatever came next, he had already succeeded. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in front of the large glass conference table. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders like a 1,000-ton boulder. He could hear the sound of his own breath in his ears, slow and deliberate, trying to steady himself for what was about to unfold. The board members around him were silent, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. It was the moment of truth, the showdown he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Across the table, his father sat, his cold eyes never leaving Jason. Richard Carmichael's presence was as imposing as ever, a man who had built an empire with unwavering control and sharp business acumen. His reputation as a ruthless businessman had earned him respect and fear in equal measure. And now, as Jason faced him, all of those years of building up the company and securing his father's approval seemed to be on the verge of unraveling. This wasn't just about business, it was about something deeper, something more personal. Jason had fought for this project from the very beginning, pouring his heart and soul into every detail. The idea was his, the vision was his, and now, his father was attempting to take it all away. Richard had always been dismissive of Jason's more unconventional ideas. Where Jason saw potential for innovation, Richard saw risk. Where Jason envisioned a future of growth and possibility, his father saw only instability. And today, in the heart of this conference room, it was all coming to a head. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, and let out a low sigh. I've been patient with you, Jason. I've let you chase your little project, your dream. But you need to face facts. You're not ready for this kind of responsibility. This project, it's a mistake. Jason's breath hitched, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for the worst. For years, he had been told he wasn't good enough, that his ideas weren't worth pursuing. But today, he was different. Today, he wasn't the unsure, timid son trying to live up to his father's expectations. Today, he was a man with a vision, a clear purpose, and a belief that the future of the company could no longer be built on the past. Jason stood taller, his voice steady and strong. It's not a mistake, Dad. It's the future. If we keep doing things the way we always have, we'll be left behind. This project isn't just another risk, it's an opportunity. We can lead the market, redefine the industry, and set ourselves apart. But we have to take that leap. We have to evolve. Richard's eyes narrowed. You talk about evolution, but you don't understand the stakes. You're talking about betting the company's future on something untested, unproven. I built this company by sticking to what works, by following the rules. And this project of yours, it doesn't fit. It never will. The room seemed to tighten, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Jason's mind raced, but he didn't falter. He had come this far not just because of his ideas, but because of the confidence he had built over the past few months. He had learned from the best Ray, his mentor, who had taught him how to stay grounded, how to stay calm under pressure. Jason could hear Ray's voice in his head, reminding him to breathe, to focus. This was his moment. Jason's eyes locked onto his father's. You built this company, Dad. You created something amazing. But that doesn't mean we can keep doing things the same way forever. Times change. Markets change. And if we don't adapt, we'll be left behind. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. You're being naive, Jason. You don't understand what it takes to succeed at this level. You think you can waltz in here and change everything without understanding the risks? You're overestimating your abilities. Jason's pulse quickened, but he didn't let his emotions get the better of him. He had to present his case, not just to his father, but to the entire room. This wasn't just about approval anymore. It was about proving that he could stand on his own, that he could lead with conviction. I've spent months working on this project, Jason continued, his voice unwavering. I've put in the hours, the research, the strategy. I've seen the potential, the demand, the need for something new. This isn't a gamble, it's a calculated move. And I'm asking you to trust me. Not because I'm your son, but because this is the right path forward. The room was silent. Jason's words hung in the air, the weight of his conviction settling over the group like a blanket. For the first time, he could see a flicker of doubt in his father's eyes. Richard wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by his own son. He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions, but Jason wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let fear or tradition hold him back. Richard's gaze softened, but only slightly. You're not ready for this, Jason. I don't want to see you fail. I've been through the ups and downs of this business, and I don't want to see you make the same mistakes I did. Jason swallowed hard. The words cut deeper than anything his father had said before. It wasn't just about the project anymore, it was about his father's doubts in him, his father's fear of what Jason could become. But Jason wasn't going to let that fear define him. He wasn't going to let his father's legacy become a cage. I'm not asking for your approval, Dad, Jason said quietly. I'm asking for your trust. I'm asking for the chance to prove that this can work. That I can lead this company into the future. You've taught me everything I know, but I have to do this my way. There was a long silence. Richard looked at his son, his expression unreadable. The tension was unbearable, and for a moment, Jason thought that his father might walk out, might take control of the situation and shut him down once and for all. But then, slowly, Richard stood up from his chair. You're right, Richard said, his voice low. You've earned the right to make this decision. I don't agree with you, but I can't deny that you believe in it. I'll give you the chance. But know this, if you fail, it's on you. No one will come to your rescue. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the warm approval he had always craved, but it was something more. It was respect. His father had finally acknowledged his strength, his vision, even if it was begrudgingly. And in that moment, Jason knew he had won. Not just the battle for the project, but a deeper victory. He had proven to himself and to his father that he was capable, that he was ready to lead. Thank you, Jason said, his voice firm with gratitude. He had fought for this moment, and now, he could finally move forward. The room erupted in murmurs as the board members exchanged glances. Jason had secured the funding and the approval he needed, but more importantly, he had earned the respect of the one person who had always been his greatest critic. As he stood there, facing his father for the first time as an equal, Jason realized that this moment wasn't just about winning. It was about finding his own place in the world, about carving out his own path. And with that, he was ready to step into the future. Jason sat alone in the conference room, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him, though his mind was somewhere else entirely. The project he had poured his heart and soul into was finally a success, one of the most successful ventures of his career. The numbers spoke for themselves, and the accolades from his colleagues and clients were well earned. Yet, in this moment of professional triumph, he felt a calm that he had never imagined could accompany such a victory. The bustling energy of the office outside seemed distant and almost irrelevant now, as if the buzz of success was no longer the thing that defined him. For the first time, Jason understood that success, at least in the way he had always defined it, wasn't the be-all and end-all of his existence. This success, this project, this recognition, this financial reward was important, but it no longer felt like the validation he had spent so many years chasing. The truth that he had only recently come to realize was that the validation he had sought from his father, from his colleagues, from the world around him, didn't matter as much as the validation he had found within himself. This success, while satisfying, wasn't the culmination of everything he had worked toward. It was simply a part of a much larger journey. He looked back at the path he had taken to get here. It had been one fraught with failures, mistakes, and setbacks. But more importantly, it had been a journey of growth. A few years ago, he would have seen those failures as signs of inadequacy, as evidence that he wasn't good enough, that he hadn't lived up to the expectations of his father or the world. Now, though, he saw them differently. He saw them as essential pieces of his evolution, as experiences that had molded him into the man he had become. He had learned, in ways both big and small, that failure wasn't something to be avoided or feared. It was simply part of the process of achieving success. Each misstep had given him something valuable, something that couldn't be gained from smooth sailing or easy wins. The road to self-awareness had been long, but it had been worth it. The transformation he had gone through had been as much internal as it had been external. He had built something lasting, but he had also built something even more significant within himself, a deeper sense of self-worth, a resilience that no amount of success could grant him in isolation, and a newfound belief in his own judgment. It was a victory of the soul, one that couldn't be measured by spreadsheets or performance reviews. Jason's relationship with his father had also evolved in ways that felt equally monumental. It had been years of tension, of trying to meet his father's expectations and feeling inadequate when he couldn't. But over the course of this journey, Jason had learned to let go of the need for his father's approval. No longer did he need to be the person his father envisioned. Jason was, for the first time, standing fully in his own shoes. He had allowed himself to stop seeking validation from a source that could never truly satisfy him, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the weight of that burden. Their relationship was still complicated, still filled with misunderstandings and unspoken expectations. But for the first time, there was a sense of mutual understanding between them. They were no longer speaking past each other, but were beginning to see one another for who they truly were. Jason had come to understand that his father's vision for him had always come from a place of care, though misdirected at times, and his father, in turn, had started to see the strength in Jason's independence. It wasn't the closure Jason had once imagined, but it was a start. There were no longer the rigid expectations of success or failure hanging in the air. There was a quiet respect, a recognition of the paths they had each walked, and a willingness to support each other in their own ways. Jason's conversation with Ray had been a pivotal moment in this process. Ray, a mentor who had witnessed Jason's evolution firsthand, had often told him that failure was an inevitable part of growth. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes but learning from them and, more importantly, continuing to move forward. Jason had always taken those lessons to heart, but now they resonated on a deeper level. The weight of Ray's wisdom now felt like an anchor, grounding him in moments of doubt. Jason had learned that success wasn't about the external markers of achievement, but about finding peace within yourself in the face of both triumph and failure. The journey he had gone through was not one he had taken alone. He had been surrounded by people who had helped him along the way, friends, mentors, and even the occasional stranger who had offered a word of encouragement when he needed it most. But ultimately, the greatest lesson he had learned was that success, in its truest form, came from being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that you had given everything you had learned from your mistakes, and had never given up on your path. It wasn't about pleasing others or proving something to the world. It was about being at peace with who you were and where you were going. The final moments of his reflection on his journey felt like a quiet, contented exhale. Jason had reached the place he had always wanted to be, but not in the way he had imagined. He had reached it not by climbing the ladder of external success but by digging deep inside himself and discovering that he had always been worthy. The external victories, both personal and professional, were just the byproducts of that internal transformation. As he looked back on everything he had been through, the struggles, the failures, the moments of self-doubt, he now understood that they were not obstacles, but stepping stones. Each one had brought him closer to a version of himself that was free from the need for validation, free from the pressure of others' expectations. And with that freedom came a new kind of success, one rooted in self-belief, resilience, and the power to embrace both the victories and the setbacks with equal grace. Jason stood up from the conference room table, looking out over the city below. The view was as familiar as it was distant. He no longer sought to conquer it, instead, he was content to simply be a part of it. He had arrived, not at the destination he had once imagined, but at a place where he could finally stand tall in his own skin. The future was no longer a looming challenge, it was a journey he was ready to embrace with the full knowledge that no matter what came next, he had the strength to face it. Jason's story, in the end, wasn't just about the success of a project or a career, it was about the success of his own transformation. It was about the quiet victory of becoming the person he was always meant to be, one lesson at a time.